probably one of the strongest things that anyone could say to someone who is struggling. If you can bring the rational and the emotional mind together, you actually start to do exactly what those things you just listed. You start to learn a little bit about the situation. You respond rather than react.
Emotional intelligence and the nuanced intangibles of life do open up, because it isn't as simple as... Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Breaking Point Podcast UK. Today we're here with Will Hawkins. Will is a coach, and a very in-depth coach, as it appears through looking through all of his content and stuff. And as always, we're going to have a chat about what he's up to, his opinion on certain topics, and see where the conversation goes. So, how are you doing today, Will?
I'm doing very well, thank you. Yourself, you good?
Very good. Yeah, I'm good. We're good. So, Will, let's start off with the obvious question of how did you get into coaching, and how did you end up sat where you are now, speaking with me on the podcast that is the Breaking Point Podcast UK?
So I started off in a academic sense, sport and exercise science, masters in sports performance, enjoyed that kind of academic life, went into looking to be a sports psychologist. I spent some time with the British Association for Sport and Exercise Science. I realised that although I thoroughly enjoyed sports psychology, it was not necessarily going to be the most lucrative pathway. So I went into private psychology, some work, and then also went into like private fitness, and worked for Fitness First for a while, for a good few years. Went up to regional manager, worked with personal trainers, building their businesses with them within the remit of Fitness First, but thoroughly enjoyed working with the psychology side of things, and that really has been a continuous thread for me and the development that I've made in my career over the years, and in the teaching that I've done with the new field of personal trainers and coaches that have come through colleges. I enhanced a lot of that area for those guys and worked a lot more focused with those in that sense. I think the idea of where I've got to now has been an accumulation of professional experience and also personal experience. My time that I've been on this planet hasn't always been particularly easy, and unfortunately my mum had a long and really quite traumatizing illness. She had Alzheimer's, early onset Alzheimer's, which I'm sure,
Wow.
for any of the guys and girls that are listening have heard of that, and obviously if any of those have had loved ones which have experienced it, it is a very debilitating illness which affects many people, and the ripple effect is great. And so that was 12 years of kind of like that when I was 18 years old. So it was kind of like a very tumultuous time for me, where I was obviously growing up through my 20s with my mum that was basically getting closer and closer to to death, and being pretty decrementally ill as time went on, which was difficult. And I never really dealt with that until after her passing. I was in a pretty toxic relationship, which took its toll on me. There was some addictive behaviours. There was an eating disorder, and it then got to a point where I, despite the fact was continuing to deliver my business, my personal training coaching business, it was still a very it was still professionally was working very well, but personally everything was falling apart, if that makes sense. So you kind of
Definitely.
like everything looks pretty good, but actually you are at any given point personally close to the breaking point, literally. And
Yeah.
It wasn't until I was introduced to a therapist by a very good friend of mine who had gone through some pretty traumatic stuff that I started to come to terms with some of the past and experiences and trauma that I'd had, and experienced a kind of, not an immediate, it was quite progressive, but a reawakening and a re-understanding of who I was, my personality, my identity, and I became a lot more mindful. I was able to master my emotions a lot more, and I took that into my coaching, and it enhanced my coaching to a greater level. I was getting much deeper connection with my clients, and
Mm.
I was having a greater impact with them. I was retaining clients for longer and supporting them in a very evolutionary fashion wherever their life was taking them. I was kind of like amalgamating my skills together, which consequently supported them anyway. So it was a really, I wouldn't say aggressive, but it was a very noticeable period of time of growth for me as an individual. And I was able to get qualified as a therapist, certified therapist, and also accredited as a professional coach through the European Mentor and Coaches Council, which has allowed me to start to broaden my practice and develop what I do to a great audience.
Wow, so that's an awful lot to unpack there as we go through the the recording. Let's sort of maybe let's start. Uh, let's go back to front. So, what would you describe as some of your key principles of your sort of coaching philosophy that you've learnt whilst going through the different stages of learning and through coaching other individuals? If you could like sum it up.
Okay, so where I've got to now is the mastery of emotions in order to be able to become more aware, regulate, and optimize for performance, whether that be in life, in work, in relationships. The fundamental philosophy I have is, if you think about lots of different pieces of a spherical puzzle, which all link together to make
Hmm.
a sphere, which is representation of you, all those pieces are glued together by emotional intelligence. It runs through as a continuous theme in all of those different areas of those shapes which hold together the sphere of who you are.
And so, in the sense, emotional intelligence. So, are the different parts of the puzzle that your different emotions, and then the glue, so to speak, is your capacity to navigate through them, or are they the different parts of you? Are they your different experiences? What is the sphere made up of in that analogy?
Well, in that analogy, the sphere is made up of values, identity,
Values. Okay.
kind of like how resilience, motivation, all of these different aspects, your relationships that you have with people, your relationships you have with work, all of these form the individual, form that kind of overall perspective, almost like if you were to look at someone from a far out, this is them, this is the identity, these are the parts of them that come together. But if they're going to be fulfilled and functioning suitably within each of those areas to have a successful life and to be enjoying life, to be able to use emotional intelligence to hold it all together is the way in which I work with my clients and work with my coaches that I support as well, in order to be able to work
Mm.
more effectively with their clients.
So I suppose what came to my mind as you were talking about that is the psychologist Carl Jung, who came up with like sort of the idea of archetypes in the psyche. He thought of
Mm-hmm.
one of the archetypes was the self or the true self, and he kind of
Mm-hmm.
described it as the guiding principle that helps us navigate ourselves through our lives,
Hmm.
and it's what allows us to rise from the ashes when we are burnt, and also that which keeps us in check when we run the risk of toppling over through arrogance or whatever. So I wonder if I feel like when you were speaking, there's a there's a similarity between the idea of your idea of emotional intelligence and then that idea that Jung was speaking about, of how it is an emotional intelligence, maybe a large part of, or at least to some degree, part of emotional intelligence is just awareness and the ability to recollect and to not, what's the word, commit ourselves to the way we're feeling a lot of the time. What do you think about that idea?
I think you're absolutely right. My uncle was a Jungian psychoanalyst, so and he kind of
Wow,
yeah,
that's awesome.
very literate in the works of Carl Jung and the subsequent archetypes and dream psychology and areas as such forth. That's probably where I kind of like in part get my interest in it from. But you are absolutely right. The
Definitely.
idea of the archetypes, I guess, if we were to bring it down into a visualization, so sometimes we talk about, especially in like leadership roles and what have you, that if you're working through a certain period of time, that you will have like board meetings, conference meetings, right, where everyone comes to the table and sits round, and each of those seats is a representation of various different archetypes. Some are more useful than others for that situation, and other parts of that kind of group of people or group of archetypes sometimes need to be just kind of put to one side and not have too much input within that particular scenario. And obviously, the one of the biggest is the ego that sits around that table. And there are times when ego is required, right, to kind of like keep yourself safe and to keep yourself, self esteem up
Alive.
in a sense, whereby the other archetypes also play a very important role when it comes to navigating, like you said, rising up from the ashes or keeping you in check. And when you think about how they all come together, the person who is effectively the self or the making the emotionally intelligent decisions would be like the CEO of that board, and would be there kind of like letting people have their say, bringing what they need to bring, observing, understanding the input they're having, but
Yeah.
ultimately not necessarily committing to what they've said around the table. It doesn't mean they have to act on it, but it's interesting to hear what that particular archetype or that particular person or that particular part has to say. When you think about awareness, it's the fundamental part of emotional intelligence. If you are
Mm.
not willing to reflect and be aware, you will never be able to regulate, which means you will find it trouble to empathize and to build effective relationships, and therefore, perform accordingly within the environment you're in. So, absolutely right. Fundamentally, awareness is the first stage in which you are able to start to become more emotionally intelligent.
Yeah, I saw a clip the other day of Andrew Huberman talking about giving people like an advice. He said, if whenever you're in like a high activation state, whether that's positive or negative, you always need to stop. I try and do this all the time as much as possible. Stop and work out what just happened. What am I possibly uh, what am I possibly expecting to happen in the near future, and then sort of try and sketch out some form of landscape in which this feeling has possibly arisen, and then try and learn something about myself or my unconscious or whatever as a result of the way I'm feeling and what has been sort of marked out on either side of that current feeling. So basically, it's just being more aware, but also, what's the word? Present. We'll go with present. That's not the word I was talking about. Thinking about, but yeah, it is the key. So if that's the first step, what's the second step?
Well,
Deliberate. That's the word.
the second step, what you're referring to there was the wise mind. So if you're in a high emotional state and your emotional mind is working in overdrive, making decisions whilst in that kind of emotional state, visceral state, is not particularly a good idea. So being
Mm-hmm.
able to check and catch yourself, and move yourself, and bring some rationality into it, so you actually get the meeting of two minds. So the rational mind, and it's a Socratic kind of theory and idea. If you can bring
Yeah.
the rational and the emotional mind together, you actually start to do exactly what those things you just listed. Start to learn a little bit about the situation. You respond rather than react. You understand rather than miss opportunity to learn, and such forth. So yeah, it's very
Yeah.
very important. The second part that you would move into with, and once you have a certain level of awareness, would be regulation. So thinking about what the kind of triggers are that could be environmental, well, mainly environmental, sometimes internal, but you tend to get kind of people or situations that would trigger a kind of an emotional response or a thought. And the part of regulation is to be able to stay and maintain awareness of that, and then process it in such a way where you start to not oppress or not to deny those thoughts and feelings that have been brought to the surface, but more to acknowledge them and understand that they're trying to give you data. It's almost like a processing. So the actual awareness allows you to intake the data, and then once you have that data, maintain awareness, process it, and then be like, okay, well, I've responded like this has been my behavior, why has that happened? And again, throughout that, maintaining the wise mind. And then when you've got to the point where you can start to tinker and tweak with the triggers or reframing, and change the outlook that you have over that particular situation, then you can start to respond rather than react. I think it's Frederick Nietzsche, I think it was him that had, for every stimulus and response, there is a gap in the middle where you can make a different decision. Or it's something
Mm.
like that. I'm terrible with quotes and like not particularly
That's
getting
right.
the right words, but getting the right
I get.
kind of getting
We
the
all
right
get it. Yeah. Yeah.
kind of emphasis, yeah. And I think that emotional intelligence plays a huge role, if not the fundamental role, in changing and like almost acting like a filtration system as you go from stimulus to response. If you have 5,000 different ways in which you can respond, the better your emotional intelligence is, you're more likely to choose to respond in the most appropriate ways. If your emotional intelligence is low, then your filter system will just push through loads of inappropriate responses, or
Yeah.
reactions, depending on the time frame. So regulation is the next point, which allows you to be able to start to fundamentally change the outcome of what is happening to you as an individual in your environment.
Brilliant. And you used the term Socratic. I just want to sort of touch on that because obviously I'm sure you're aware Socrates, the way that the story of Socrates' death, I think it was, of how the Roman officials basically said, we're going to have to kill you because you're espousing all this sorts of possible damaging information to the youth of the
Yeah,
society, and they're all paying attention to you. And he said, um, so he was like, okay, well, I better get the heck out of here then, because otherwise I'm going to die. And he always spoke about this like voice or this daemon that he had inside of his head, which is, I think, is akin to what Jung was getting to or alluding to with the idea of the true self, and what I think God, possible representation of what God is from a religious
Mm.
perspective, is that possible voice, at least to some part. And the voice or the daemon said to him, "No, you should just stay." And he said, "Don't." It said, don't flee, just stay." And he stayed, and he because he was like it said something, or I don't know, but he was in his 80s. He was probably going to die soon, and this voice just said to him, "There's no point running away. Just stay." And he just stayed, and they killed him. And he sort of, if you, I haven't read Socrates, but I've heard that he that was what, in theory, he believed set him apart from other people and maybe even other philosophers, is that he always listened to that voice. He'd always listened to his
Mm.
conscience, which is probably the most accurate term we have for it. And I think that's absolutely genius. And I would recommend to anyone who is really struggling to and doesn't know where to turn, to listen to that conscience whenever it says, "Don't do that," or "You don't mean this," or "That's not true," because that's in the darkness. That's the possible only form of light that some people can have if they're in complete and utter pitch black. So I like that. It was good that you brought up Socrates, because I think that is definitely, it's all linked in, and it's all incredibly
Oh,
relevant.
yeah.
So
I think that you also, a lot of the philosophers throughout the different ages have brought a lot to the table. But I think that what's the job of the kind of youth, what would have been their youth in then days, but then also as we move on through generations, is to be able to translate that accordingly so it's actually applicable. Because some of the
mm,
things are and do remain very applicable that the great philosophers, ancient philosophers, spoke about. But I also think that sometimes you have to use different language or interpret it in a way in which people can understand it and relate to it within modern society, which is obviously very different in many ways, but also similar in very many ways to what it was then. I think like what you were talking about with the idea of him staying, or the idea of the conscious, is to be aware of your true self, your authenticity, your values, and what sculpts your feeling of joy, enlightenment, feelings of happiness, feeling of contentment, serenity. And ultimately, if you are living through your values and you're authentic with your values, then you're in a position of really kind of doing exactly what Socrates did when he decided that
mm,
he was going to stay, is that he was authentic with who he was. He valued his position that he held where he was currently geographically located. He wanted to have the impact because it was obviously a value to him. Whether he died or whether he was killed was irrelevant, because, as you said, he was 80. So when you think about authenticity, when you think about values, and when you think about decision making, if you make decisions based around your true self and your authentic nature, then it will work out fine.
mm.
The problem is when you start making decisions based around things you don't truly value, you that aren't actually in line with who you are and what you want to do and what you want to achieve because of various external influences.
Yeah.
And a lot of work that I do with people is to dig into the values and to understand the values, to build authenticity early on, and then start to look at what's going on with those individuals and start to bring them back in a line with their true self.
Yeah, that's what Jordan Peterson, who I'm a big admirer of, has spoken about in the past, when he said telling the truth is the best way to have the adventure of your life. Because he says if you lie and an outcome manifests itself, it's not truly you. It's not your life. It's something. It's the life of something else. Whereas if you tell the truth, and even if something bad manifests itself in the short term, at least in theory, you are contributing to. You're not partaking in a lie, so therefore it's possibly the best. That is the best possible case scenario because it's
Mm.
the one that you think about a lie is it has to be propped up within a framework, at least as the lie progresses, of within amongst other lies. Whereas when you tell the truth, both to yourself and both to other people, that none of that exists. There is no framework of deception. It is purely raw truth and honesty, and therefore you're lighter. I always think that I feel lighter. A guilty, we use the term of something as weighing us down, don't we? And we don't really
Mm.
know why we sort of accept the idea of being weighed down, but we just do accept the idea of being weighed down. And I think it's because there's something trauma, lies, deception, all these things do weigh us down, and truth and forgiveness and healing, they're all light frequencies, or maybe frequencies is the wrong term, but somehow within some realm of who we are as an entity, there is a weight attached to negativity and lightness,
Mm.
which is why these terms are relevant to this form of sort of language.
Absolutely. Absolutely, can agree more.
Yeah. So let's, before we finish this sort of topic, an idea that came to me as we were talking. Maybe you'd want to get into this earlier, maybe you don't want to get into this. But given all you know now, I'm sure you've done this exercise. What would you go back and say to if you could have a conversation with your 22-year-old self, or maybe the point when you were at your lowest, when you felt most burdened by life and restricted by whatever activities you're possibly engaging in? What would what would you say to that individual, given all the knowledge that you have now, that you think would be able to help that young person the most?
Well, it's always a difficult one when you think, well, what would you say to someone? But I think that the probably one of the strongest things that anyone could say to someone who is struggling, or if you could go back and say to someone, say to yourself, who I think never lose hope, keep
Mm.
working, keep kind of keep living, keep working stuff out, because
Yeah.
even though you might be faced with what seems to be an insurmountable amount of pressure or overwhelm or disillusion or misunderstanding or hurt or pain or anguish. And there are some really awful things that happen to people, individually and on a
Absolutely.
societal level as well. But arguably, if you're in a position where things are happening for you that seem to be against you, sorry, things happening against you, look at the way in which you can start to grow and develop and understand. And I know I've been through some pretty pretty rubbish things over the years. Like my early 20s wasn't great, but ultimately those things have shaped who I am now,
Mm.
and they've shaped the practice that I deliver, the impact I have on people, the guidance and empathy and compassion that I'm able to have with people is because of the things that I've gone through. So I wouldn't. I mean, there are certain things I would change. I wouldn't want my mum to obviously suffer the
Yeah.
way that she suffered with the disease that she had. Of course, that's a given. But I wouldn't want to change pain, and I wouldn't want to change anguish or the challenges that I went through, because if I didn't, I wouldn't be who I am now. And I think that it
Yeah.
does give you the opportunity to grow. It does give you the opportunity to be and become something that's a true human.
Use. What do you mean by the term true human? I never heard that before. Or what do you
So
think you
I
mean
think
by that?
we get a very, so when you think about a humanistic approach to things, allowing, where you allow for emotions to exist, you are in a position where you can start to experience the peaks and troughs and appreciations of ups and downs, and know that, I think that everything is and does pass, and everything is running through temporary. It's not fixed. It's not unsolvable.
Distance
Things
shall
change,
pass.
and change is constant. And to be part of that process is to be human. And it's an
Mm.
important, if you were to take someone, for example, who and devoid them from the opportunity of feeling challenging times, sadness or difficulties, and then feeling elation and joy, and you were to have them on a constant equilibrium where nothing was either great or good, or nothing was either bad or troubling, then I think that would essentially make someone less. I mean, I'm not saying it would make someone not a human, but it would make someone more like robotic, right? In the sense whereby they lose the nature of emotion and the role that it plays within their life.
Yeah. That's something that I've sort of like experimented with in recent years, because once I became aware of the whole idea that we're not our emotions, and the possible, or at least sort of the Taoist answer, is to become the awareness that is behind our feelings and sensations, as opposed to attaching ourselves to the
Mm,
sensations. So we're not the peak or the trough. We're not whoever we are, or the entity that brings us to the peak or the trough of the wave. We are the, I don't know, either the awareness that observes the wave, or maybe even we're the being that facilitates the development of the wave, whatever. But then I found myself, I got into a position where I could quite, within reason, quite effectively stave off the troughs, so keep myself afloat. Oh no, what was it? What was it? Oh yeah, it was, I could effectively uh sort of curtail the development of the peak, so I didn't feel too elated, artificially elated, so to speak. So I would be able to
mhm,
remain sort of abstemious and balanced. But then it came to the bringing yourself up from the troughs. That can be quite a difficult process. So then I had this sort of inner dialogue of, well, maybe that's step one, and then maybe step two is to sort of take a step back, so to speak, and go, actually, what I'm doing now is I'm diminishing what it is to be human. And then maybe
mm,
once you accept that, then maybe then you can move on to step three. And maybe step three is the capacity to ride the waves and the lows with a slightly more control and awareness of who you are. But you do raise a brilliant point of, a huge aspect of life is this kind of, in the same way of an addiction, it isn't just the positive aspects of an addiction that are the addictive aspects. It's actually the negative aspects as well that become addictive. I always use the example, sort of crude example, but I used to play FIFA a lot when I was a bit younger. And when you rage on FIFA and people rage quit and they go, oh, I'm never going to play this game again. I hate it. It's the worst thing ever. And obviously they keep on playing it. And it's because if a game was perfect in every single way, it would probably get less. I wonder if EA or whoever deliberately put in features that are infuriating, so that they can sort of utilize or piggyback off of that human tendency to become addicted to
create
not just the
create the
positive,
peaks
but
and the troughs.
yeah, exactly. They create the peaks and
Yeah.
the troughs to keep people hooked in and addicted to their game, and it's that fluctuation and that oscillation between the great moments and I'm never going to play this game again that keep you hooked. And it is when you if you attempt to eradicate that, what are you left with? Even though keeping it and just being trapped in this cycle of up and down, which I think I genuinely think most people are. That is what life is, really. It's life is a not a problem that's meant to be solved, which is kind of what we're doing, but it's an experience that's supposed to be experienced. And I do think there's an incredible amount of truth to that. Obviously, it's
Mm.
fine to say that when you're feeling okay, but when you're feeling bad, it's a completely different story. So it's just another one of those perennial dilemmas that we all find ourselves in.
Well, I think you've got the situation when you think about peaks and troughs of emotions, especially, and we think about, we're not we can observe emotions and we can find them interesting, and we can tether ourselves to an emotion as much as we want. And I think one of the outcomes, or one of the desired outcomes of emotional intelligence, is to elongate, enhance, and maximize the connection to positive emotions, joy, serenity, happiness. And by doing that, you essentially increase the enjoyment of that period of time of your life, or whatever it might be. But it will pass, and there will be times that will come and will be more challenging and will have negative emotions attached to them, where the troughs come in. But the troughs, the eight, and I know I use this a lot when I think about when I speak about my clients. Some have addictions, some have in all sorts of different forms. Some
Yeah.
just have varying moods. That some have various different kind of issues that kind of pull them down to a certain degree, pull them
Yeah.
into those troughs. But
Yeah.
the aim of the game is to keep the troughs as short and shallow as possible,
Mm,
and keeps the
definitely.
peaks as long as and as high, not as high necessarily, but just keep them up above the threshold, right?
Yeah.
And I think that
Oh,
that's
that's
something
really good.
where, like you said, the switching between the two effectively, because the troughs will pass as well. The peaks will pass, the troughs will pass. It all passes, but I think the most important thing out of the overarching, and I work a lot in positive psychology, and one of the greatest things within positive psychology is, in my opinion, is acceptance. It is such a crucial it's such a crucial cog in the machine of an emotionally intelligent, fulfilling existence, is to accept when things are how they are. And that doesn't mean roll over and be like, okay, yeah, sure, do that then, or I'm just going to let that go because it's I'm an accepting person. It's not that. That can sometimes be misconstrued. But what it is a sense of going, well, actually, what we've got here is something that I have actioned everything that I can control in my sphere of control. There's some things which I kind of can control, and I've done as much as I can with that, but ultimately that lays somewhere else. And there's some things over here I've got zero control over. And that's the art of acceptance, is being able to very quickly and effectively understand that and process that and go, yes, I can control that. I've done everything I can. I've done what I can do here. This I can't control. And if the outcome is not how you want it to be, then it's disappointing and it's upsetting, and you feel that negative trough, but you very quickly accept and pull yourself back out again. Give you a very personal example, which has happened to me and my girlfriend recently. We made an offer to rent a property. It was a beautiful property out in Dulwich, really nice, green area, which is tree lined and all that stuff. Perfect size, everything right. Went in there. We were both really excited about it. Both thinking, "Oh, this is gonna be a great place to live." There were some ups and downs to it, but basically we wanted it. Made an offer, and we didn't get it, and it was disappointing. But very quickly, we sat down and okay, right, we've done that, yeah, we've done that, yeah, we've done that. Okay, we've done everything we could do within our control, and this was out of our control, and it didn't go our way. And you move on from it quite quickly. You don't fester, you don't catastrophize, you don't find yourself in that trough getting deeper and deeper and deeper, and then it consequently affecting other things that you're doing. So I
Yeah.
think the acceptance part is a huge thing that emotional intelligence focuses on to utilize effectively.
It's like that. There's that sort of simplified flow diagram where it's like you're worried about something. Can you do something about it? Yes. Then why are you
Yeah,
worried? Can you do something about it? No. Then why are you worried? And if you could,
yeah,
if you're going to be an incredibly simple and facetious man, you could say, "Well, there you go, everybody. Look at that flow diagram. What have you got to worry about?
yeah.
That's it." And
But
obviously, that's not
and then
reality, but
no, but it's not
it's got some
reality.
sentiment behind
There's obviously nuances and complexities to it, but arguably, you know, you know, there's sometimes the most effective things, the most effective way out of things is to keep it as simple as possible. It's
it.
like the flow diagram is great, or the pathway of decision making sometimes is exactly what's required to add a level of rationality to what is an emotional mind. Again, we're
Yeah.
bringing ourselves back to the wise mind. It's like, well, okay, I've got A/B structures which I use with clients. Like, so I'm going, okay, well, this is your your kind of outcome A, or your process A, and this is your process B. So you decide which one you go to depending on where you are, where you feel your mind is operating. Because sometimes if you're very cold and very rational, you need to bring in a bit of emotion. And sometimes if you're very emotional, you need to bring a bit of rationality. And I think that what you've just described there as a simplified flow diagram is a really useful tool if you need to bring in a little bit of rationality and kind of recalibrate to find the wise mind position.
Yeah. Do you know the story of the, is it, I think it's the Chinese farmer or something
Yeah,
that was, I think it,
yeah. And this one that goes to war and loses his arm.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. That story. There's such a, as akin with the flow diagram, it's not reality because, well, it's an archetypal story, which, to be fair, maybe that is more reality than reality. Maybe that's the highest form of reality, which it probably is. If it is, that's what makes it an archetype. It's the highest, the most true it possibly could be. But
Mm.
it lacks the nuances of everyday life. But nevertheless, there is great sentiment in that idea of. I'm obviously not with everything, and some things are just evidently awful, and that's another perennial catastrophe of life. Is that we are people get taken out by the knees quite often, and it can be truly catastrophic, and therefore, and that's when the world of choice and emotional intelligence and the nuanced intangibles of life do open up, because it isn't as simple as, you know, maybe this is a good thing in disguise, when no, this is just a bad thing. But I think the only possible way you can move forward from an awful thing happening is what you're doing, and what you sort of alluded to earlier, which is move forward, attempting to harness what has happened to you and use it as some form of uh maybe ammunition or
Voice,
crystallized
launch a bit
voice.
of impact.
Yes, exactly, voice of impact, and an endeavor to help people, and to and that is fundamentally the human story, really. That's kind of what we're all doing. And then that when atrocity is committed, often it's because people go the other way and they reach a different conclusion, and they're sort of infected with the opposing spirit, so to speak. You were talking about
Yeah,
values, and Jung. I think one of I read Carl Jung's. I mean, I didn't really understand it because flipping heck, what is that guy about? But I read his. I think it was his like almost autobiography of dreams, memories, dreams, and reflections,
oh,
which was maybe his last book.
oh,
And he wrote
that
how
was a brave one.
yeah, exactly. I need to read another one. Someone gave it to me. Um, I want to read the Red Book, but I don't know if you can get your hands on that nowadays. I think it's incredibly expensive.
Oh, that's not the
Um,
one with this. That's the one with. Is that the one with the serpent on it? Oh no, that's not. That's something else. No, that's
oh,
something else.
I,
Then.
I should read them all. It's like it's pretty atrocious. Not atrocious, but it's not very good of me that I haven't read them all. But he was speaking about how he knew he was going to fall out with Freud because they had a disagreement. I think the disagreement was over values. I think maybe it was either Freud or Nietzsche who said people must pick their own values, and Jung said people can't pick their own values. They are bestowed upon us from birth, so to speak, or something along those lines, which is an interesting idea. An interesting idea about how
Mm,
the world around us, because we perceive the world through our values and through our own narrative lens, and his idea that we can't pick that narrative lens, quite deterministic. But I just wondered, what was your opinion on? Do you think we can, in your opinion, do you think we can pick our own values, or are they bestowed upon us or assigned to us?
I think that values are bestowed upon us, or we do find ourselves in environments where our values are curated by those that are in them or the circumstances that we face. That being said, we are we are humans of the ability to be able to decide and make decisions. We do have autonomy, and I think that that's the conscious mind is that is the autonomy in its existence. So if, say, for example, someone is born into a family that is and does create a pathway of decision making which leads to values being lived through. We live through our values, right? So you live through your values. You can't attain a value. You can't It
Yeah,
can't be something that you've completed. If you've been painting a picture for if you've been painting a picture and you finished it, you put the paintbrush down, you stand back, you go, brilliant. I have finished creativity. I've completed creativity. It's
yeah.
not something you are creative. You live as a creative person, as an example, or any of the other values. Integrity, or you are
It's a
someone who
spirit,
grows and
isn't it?
develops and learns. Yeah, it's so I think that for and I've coached people which have had a set of values that have been quote unquote bestowed upon them, and with some questions and with some reflections and with some digging into actually. And this is the key thing. It's like if you have and you are living through a set of values and you ignore the emotions that are connected to those values, then you will relinquish any kind of autonomy and you will have values bestowed upon you and you will live them. However, if you are reflective enough and authentic enough with yourself to listen to the emotions and feel the emotions that you have when you are, you know, maybe moving towards a set of values or moving away from a set of values, if you listen to and to what is being said to you for the emotions and how you feel them, you will figure out whether that is the right set of values for you to, or the right value for you to be engaging in. And that, I think, is where that's the difference between like the determinist theory of like this is your personality, this is your set of values, this is your setup, and you can only operate within these parameters. Well, I don't agree with that. I think that people can change. People can change their the value propositions they have and the value connections they have and how they live. It happens on a certain level of frequency when people take the time to be reflective and take the time to actually listen to themselves and what their feelings and emotions are saying. So I mean, let's take a practical example. So when someone has a midlife crisis, well, what is a midlife crisis? I mean, everyone, you're having a midlife crisis, but what actually is a midlife crisis? Well, what it stands for is someone who has lived to the midway point of their life, give or take, and they've actually been living in a certain way, tethered to a certain set of values, actions, behaviours, achievements, any of the things which formulate an identity of who they are. And they've got to the point, sometimes family, sometimes marriage are included in those things, or career and progression, all those kind of things. Basically, they're the fundamental aspects of their life, and they've reached that point, and they've gone, I actually don't really care about this, or this isn't actually part of this. I've got to here, and I'm now at a position where I'm reflecting, and I'm like, I've only got another half of my life to live. I've reached the halfway point. Shit, I haven't been doing anything that I really wanted to do. Well, I've been doing like 10% of what I want to do. Obviously, that is a very dysfunctional and tragic thing if it's a marriage and a family that's involved and such forth, and that's obviously quite a sorrowful thing to obviously hear about, but it does happen, or people get to, they're a doctor for X amount of times and they've worked through because culturally it's been expected of them. The family expects the person to become the doctor, so on and so forth. They work their way up there, and then they're living this life they're not truly connected to, they don't truly value, and then that's where the midlife crisis kicks in.
I would say it's not just that; that occurs in tandem with the sudden sort of realization of biological fragility, and how,
Yes.
or at least that experience will be compounded with that realization of how, oh dear, I've got less and less time to live. I'm never going to be
Yes.
23 anymore, and this is what could be headed in front of me, which is why
Well,
it's
yeah.
so important. Yeah, carry on. Yeah.
Well, you get health scares at that time, or you realise effectively you are on a countdown. You also you might have seen a close person like a sibling, for example, or a parent. A parent has ill health and passes away prematurely than what you would necessarily appreciate or anticipate, rather. Sorry, and then there's a lot of what I would call emotive triggers that can happen around that kind of period of someone's midpoint of their life, and it does take. And when we think about male suicide, it's huge, and I think one of the contributing factors is the overwhelming pressure that you don't see that men feel that they're under to actually formulate and progress through a sociological structure that doesn't necessarily give
Completely.
room to breathe. And I'm not saying that that's not the case for women that aren't put through, sociological structures and have expectancies put on them at all. Both genders have the expectancies and constrictions and those like shackles put upon them. I just think men don't deal with it particularly well. Men struggle a lot more when it comes to when we know the processing emotions and stuff like that aren't particularly great for men to be able to do. And then when they get to this point where things happen which are highly emotive triggers at a very vulnerable age, well, that's why you've got such an astronomical amount of death is linked to male suicide. When you think about
Yeah.
men's death around that kind of, I think it's is it under
Yeah.
40? I think it's under 45. The biggest killer is male suicide.
Yeah. I think it is for women as well, to be fair. So, but it's not acceptable, is it? And it's not sustainable. But I think you're absolutely spot on. And the more and more I go through life, I'm less and less. I'm becoming disillusioned with the idea of social construction. I really think it's a red herring. I don't buy into it. I maybe I am slightly too biologically deterministic, but I do think a lot of this suicide is because the masculine, and there's very little societal construction in this, but men are judged not by society, because I don't think society is really societal construction is relevant, but not in this context. It's relevant in other contexts. They're judged by women in particular, predominantly by their ability to provide, and what's happening nowadays is that is being not incorrectly, but for whatever reason, that's being stripped away from them, at least in part. And what happens when men age is, I think they watch their capacity to provide fall away, and I think that's an incredible. And they, at that point, they need to pivot. There probably needs to be a societal or a self desire to pivot what you value yourself, or what you value your self-worth from, and not put it on your ability to provide. But you're right, there's a in the Barbie movie, there's a scene, which is an awful movie, by the way. In the
Mm.
Barbie movie, there's a scene where one of the not a Barbie, she's not a Barbie, she's from the real world. She lists off all these things of how hard it is and how difficult it is to be a woman. And fair enough, I'm not disputing any of that at all. But you could say the exact same, just a different set of circumstances for being a man. So the idea that it's the women are having it incredibly difficult and men aren't, which maybe people say that's not what Barbie was trying to convey. Either way, in that particular scene, that is what they were kind of possibly
Mm.
attempting to
Mm.
convey, and I thought that was wrong, and it is objectively wrong as well, not just morally wrong. So it is, yeah. The it's a tricky topic, but
I think it is a tricky topic, but I think what from a position of division is something that we really want to avoid. Because actually, when you think
yeah.
about different cultures, different socioeconomic backgrounds, different genders. There is differences between all of those things, and that's what makes the world interesting, right? But
Hmm.
I think what has to be very consciously acknowledged is the fact that the biggest divide and the biggest struggles that happen is not necessarily through like genders, cultures, or people from different backgrounds and outlooks on life, but it is between the kind of like almost I kind of like really want to like the totalitarian people which orchestrate various different you know parts of society which create
Yeah.
division, which create
Hmm.
or everyone
Yeah.
that's kind of like beneath them or exists in other areas effectively becomes divided and becomes distracted and ununified by irrelevant things, when actually the baseline is we're all humans, we all struggle, we've all got
Yeah.
we've all got
Completely.
positive things that happen and difficulties that happen. We've all got backgrounds which aren't ideal, and some which are more ideal, or seem to be more
Completely.
ideal.
We're
But I
all
think
blessed
what the
and cursed.
focus is, yeah, exactly. But I think what the focus is and should remain is not on what divides us, but actually what unifies us and what brings us together as humans, and what culturally, from gender differences, from all these kind of things, what actually is the thread that is and continuation of what brings us together as humans.
Perfect. Yeah, I agree. I think, and that's in theory what progressivism is endeavouring to do and is doing in part.
Mm,
But
mm,
in the same way that there is no yin without yang, any existence, any entity in life, in order for it to is it in order for it to cultivate, or maybe even in order for it to exist, probably to exist, it has to have that balance. And we're seeing this now with the obsession with demographics across parts of society. And I
mm,
always find
mm,
it ironic how people that are in theory obsessed with freedom and uh, sort of lack of categories and boundlessness are implementing and using categories to describe people more than anyone else. So, and the point
mm,
is of trying to make is that the more pronounced you are in one aspect, there will always be a desire, and under a sort of I've found the word the other day, I was looking for it, clandestine, which I'm going to use all the time now,
mm.
which is like an underground kick pushback from whatever it
Yeah.
is that's pushing you out that way. And we have to accept that and understand that that is a human inevitability.
Well, it's the law. For every opposite, for every force, there's an opposite reaction, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.